Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're doing another deep dive today, and this time we're going to be looking at the U.S. economy.
All right.
But we're going to be looking at it with a twist. We're going beyond just the headlines.
Okay.
And we're going to be exploring some surprising consequences of policies from the Trump administration.
Interesting.
And to do that, we've got a really interesting mix of sources for you today.
Oh, okay.
We've got news reports, expert commentary from publications like the Financial Times and CNBC, and for a more global perspective, we're even going to be dipping into Nikkei Asia.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
a good mix.
It is.
Yeah.
So we're hoping that this is going to give us a really well-rounded view of what's going on. You know, we often think about the economy as this big abstract thing.
Right.
You know, it's kind of like out there somewhere.
Yeah.
But what we're going to see today is how seemingly small things, like the price of eggs, can actually be connected to much larger issues, even things like wildfire recovery efforts.
Exactly.
I have to admit, you've got me intrigued. So let's start with something that I think everybody's been feeling lately,
Okay.
and that is inflation.
Right.
We've all seen our grocery bills going up. It's not just in our heads, right?
No. Inflation's definitely hitting hard, and it's actually higher than many economists predicted.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. For example, egg prices
Yeah.
have jumped a staggering 53% in just a year. And we're seeing this especially in places like Los Angeles, where the cost of living was already high.
Wow, 53%. That's a real gut punch, especially for families on tight budgets. But how does this,
Right.
how does this connect to the bigger economic picture?
Well, it's making the Federal Reserve, the Fed, really hesitant to lower interest rates. They were expected to do so to try and stimulate the economy. But high inflation throws a wrench in that plan, because if they lower rates now, it could actually make inflation even worse.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
So it's a bit of a balancing act for them.
yeah, definitely.
Okay, but hold on. Why would lowering interest rates risk making inflation worse?
Okay,
Explain it to me like I'm 5.
okay, so think of it this way.
Okay,
Lower interest rates mean it's cheaper to borrow money, right?
right.
So when borrowing is cheap, people and businesses tend to spend more.
Okay.
So that increased spending can drive up demand for goods and services, which can then lead to, you guessed it,
Higher prices.
even higher prices, yeah.
Okay, so with the Fed potentially holding off on lowering rates,
Right.
how is that playing out in the stock and bond markets?
It's creating a lot of uncertainty, which, as you know, investors generally don't like.
Right.
So investors are trying to figure out what this means for the future of the economy. And so we're seeing fluctuations in both the stock and bond markets as they adjust their positions.
Okay, so inflation is a headache, the Fed is in a tough spot, and the markets are on edge. Got it. But let's pivot now to those Trump administration policies
Okay.
and the ripple effects that we're seeing. What about those tariffs on steel and aluminum?
Oh, yeah,
I remember those being a big deal when they happened.
they were a big deal, and they're still having an impact. In fact, the CEO of Ford
Okay.
recently warned that these tariffs are really hurting the auto industry. And he even went so far as to say it could cause unprecedented damage.
Oh, wow. Unprecedented damage. Okay, that's a pretty serious prediction. Remind me,
Yeah.
what was the original goal of these tariffs?
Well, the idea was to protect American steel and aluminum producers from foreign competition,
Okay.
right? Which, you know, on the surface, it sounds like a good idea.
Protect American jobs, yeah.
Protect American jobs, yeah. But in reality, it's much more complicated than that.
Right, because Ford, and I'm sure other companies, rely on imported materials.
Exactly, yeah.
So these tariffs just
Yeah.
end up making everything more expensive for them.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a classic example of unintended consequences,
Okay.
right? You know, the tariffs were meant to boost American industry,
Yeah.
but they're actually hurting other American businesses.
Right.
So it raises the question, are the benefits really outweighing the costs?
Yeah, and it's not just the auto industry, right?
No.
There was that story about Coca-Cola switching to more plastic bottles
Oh, right.
because of the increased cost of aluminum.
Yes, that's right. And, you know, it's kind of ironic considering the administration's, stance on plastic straws.
Right.
Yeah. And it really highlights how interconnected all of these issues are.
Right.
We're trying to tackle plastic pollution, but then economic policies end up pushing companies to use more plastic. It's like, what are we doing?
It feels like we're fighting a losing battle sometimes. You know, it makes you realize that you can't just look at these things in isolation. It's like this giant game of economic dominoes where, one thing knocks into another and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Yeah. So to continue that domino effect, let's bring in another policy.
All right.
that had some pretty far-reaching consequences, and that's the crackdown on immigration. And, this isn't just a political issue. This is something that's actually having a real impact on the economy, especially for businesses in places like Los Angeles.
For sure.
I've heard about businesses struggling to find workers.
Yeah.
Everything from restaurants to construction.
Yeah.
But how does that connect back to, the bigger economic issues we've been discussing?
Well, when you have fewer workers, you have a tighter labor market. So employers have to compete for workers, which often means offering higher wages. And then those higher wages get passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. And that feeds right back into inflation.
Ah, okay. So we've got this cycle where policies aimed at one area, like immigration, end up having these unintended consequences in other areas, like inflation.
Yeah.
And it all kind of comes full circle.
It all comes back.
But that's not even the whole story, right? Because the labor shortage is also affecting things like wildfire recovery efforts.
Oh, right. That's true. Yeah, because many of those jobs relied heavily on immigrant labor, so now it's even harder to find people to do that, crucial work.
Okay, if we've got inflation, a tight labor market, businesses struggling, even wildfire recovery being impacted, it's a lot to take in.
It is a lot.
But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about a rather unexpected player in all of this. Elon Musk.
Okay.
Do you remember that kind of unusual press conference with him and President Trump?
Oh, yeah. How can I forget? It was definitely memorable. I mean, President Trump seemed perfectly content to take a back seat.
Yeah.
While Musk went on this somewhat rambling defense of his work on government efficiency.
Yeah, it was a little strange. It's almost like he was trying to convince everyone, including himself, that he was, making a difference.
Right.
But there was that one story that he told that really stuck with me.
Yeah.
The one about USAID and condoms?
Oh, right. The one where he claimed that USAID was spending millions of dollars on condoms for Gaza.
Yes.
Yeah, and implied that it was an example of, air quotes, corruption.
Yeah.
Which definitely got people talking. But then later on, Musk admitted that the story was actually false.
Right, yeah. I remember thinking at the time, wait, is that true?
Right.
It sounds a little too outlandish.
Right.
But it feeds into a larger concern, I think, about the Trump administration and its approach to government.
Exactly. The budget cuts, the firing of inspectors general, the lack of transparency.
Yeah.
All of that raises concerns about potential misconduct and the erosion of accountability.
Yeah. I think that this whole Musk incident, as weird as it was, kind of seems like a microcosm of what was happening more broadly.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
It makes you wonder about the role of, private individuals in influencing government policy and the potential for things to go awry, especially when facts are kind of blurred.
Right. Exactly.
It's a good reminder to always be critical of what we hear, even from people that we might admire or trust.
Yeah. Always double check.
But speaking of needing a critical eye, let's move on to the international implications of all of this. I'm really curious to hear what Nikki Asia had to say.
Okay. Yeah, so they published a pretty thought-provoking piece arguing that President Trump's cuts to foreign aid were actually damaging U.S. credibility in Asia, and that China was stepping in to fill that void.
That makes sense. If the U.S. pulls back, it kind of creates an opportunity for other countries, especially China, to exert their influence.
Right, yeah.
But what were some of the specific examples that they cited?
Well, they highlighted the case of KAIST, the Korean Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. And USAID played a really crucial role in its development, which ultimately contributed to South Korea's incredible economic rise. Yeah. And so they argue that by cutting back on such aid, the U.S. risks losing valuable partnerships and influence.
So it's not just about the money itself, it's about the message it sends.
Right. It's about, by investing in other countries, we're building relationship and demonstrating our commitment to their success.
Right.
But when we pull back, it can be interpreted as a lack of interest or support.
Okay, so we've got this interesting dynamic where the U.S. is seemingly losing ground in Asia while China is gaining momentum. But let's bring it back home for a moment and talk about something that happened that frankly sounds a bit bizarre. It involves the Associated Press, a White House press conference, and the name of a certain body of water.
Oh, yes. The U.S. Gulf incident.
Yes.
Yeah. That's right. It sounds almost comical, right?
It does, yeah.
But it actually speaks to a much larger and more concerning issue, press freedom under the Trump administration.
Okay, I have to hear this. Fill me in on what happened.
So the Associated Press was barred from attending a White House press conference because they refused to refer to the Gulf of Mexico as the U.S. Gulf, which was apparently the administration's preferred term.
Wait, seriously, they got excluded over the name of a gulf? That seems a little extreme.
Yeah, it does. But it fits into this larger pattern of the administration attempting to control the narrative
Okay.
and punish media outlets that they perceive as unfavorable. They frequently attacked journalists and news organizations that reported critically on their actions.
That's really concerning. It sounds like they were trying to stifle dissent and control the flow of information.
That's exactly what it was. They wanted to shape the narrative
Yeah.
and discredit any reporting that did align with their message.
But the Associated Press stood their ground, right? I mean,
Yeah, they did.
they didn't just cave to that pressure.
No, they absolutely did. They argued that, while they acknowledged the president's preference, they had a responsibility to use established and internationally recognized terminology. In other words, they refused to compromise their journalistic integrity.
Yeah, good for them. It's a small act of defiance,
Yeah.
but I think it sends a powerful message about the importance of a free and independent press.
Yeah, it does. And it highlights how seemingly insignificant things,
Yeah,
even the name of a gulf,
right.
can become battlegrounds in a larger fight for democratic norms and principles.
Wow. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground already, and it's clear that there's so much more to unpack here.
There is, and it's all interconnected in really fascinating ways. From the price of eggs to the name of a gulf, we're seeing how policy decisions, unintended consequences, and global power dynamics are shaping our world.
And you know what? I'm even more intrigued now than I was at the beginning of this deep dive.
That's the beauty of it. The more we explore, the more connections we uncover, and the better equipped we are to understand the complexities of the world around us. Yeah, it really is like peeling back the layers of an onion,
Yeah,
and each new discovery reveals another layer of complexity.
right.
But understanding these complexities is so crucial, especially in today's world.
Absolutely. It feels like we're constantly bombarded with information these days,
Right.
and it's hard to know what to trust or where to even begin making sense of it all.
Yeah, it's true. We live in an age of information overload, and it's more important than ever to be really discerning consumers of information.
Yeah.
We need to think critically, question what we hear, and consider different viewpoints.
You're preaching to the choir here.
Right.
I'm constantly fact-checking and cross-referencing, but this whole situation with the Associated Press,
Yeah,
it's a stark reminder of how fragile press freedom can be,
it is.
even in a country like the U.S.
It is. Yeah, and the AP's refusal to bow to that pressure
Right.
is really commendable, I think.
Yeah.
It highlights the vital role that journalists play in a democracy, holding those in power accountable
Right.
and providing the public with accurate information.
Yeah, and it's not just about journalists, right? It's about all of us having access to reliable information.
Right.
So we can make informed decisions, whether it's at the ballot box or just in our daily lives.
Absolutely. A free and independent press is essential for a healthy democracy.
Yeah.
And when that freedom is threatened, it undermines the very foundation of our society.
This is a good moment, I think, to step back and acknowledge that, this deep dive is focusing a lot on the actions and policies of the Trump administration.
Right.
And, it's important to remember that these are really complex issues.
They are.
With multiple perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. There are certainly differing viewpoints on all the topics we've discussed.
Yeah.
And it's crucial to consider those different perspectives. For every action, there's often a reaction.
Right.
And understanding both sides of the story is essential.
Yeah. Okay, so with that said, let's continue exploring the international side of things for a bit.
Okay.
We were talking about Nikkei Asia's take on U.S. foreign policy in Asia, and they made a really strong argument that, Trump's aid cuts
Right.
were damaging U.S. influence in the region.
Yeah.
But aren't there also arguments in favor of reducing foreign aid? I mean, what are some of the counterpoints to that perspective?
Well, some people argue that foreign aid can actually create dependency,
Okay.
which could potentially hinder a country's own development.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right. And others believe that those funds could be better spent addressing domestic issues here in the U.S.
Right.
And there are certainly valid concerns about ensuring that aid is used effectively and not lost to corruption or mismanagement.
Yeah. Okay, so it's not a simple black and white issue.
No, it's not.
There are legitimate concerns on both sides.
Right.
But going back to Nikkei Asia's argument about China stepping in to fill the void, what are some specific examples of that happening? How is China asserting its influence in the region?
Well, for one, they've been investing heavily in infrastructure projects across Asia and Africa through their Belt and Road Initiative.
Okay.
And this is creating economic ties and dependencies that could really shift the balance of power away from the U.S.
It sounds like a modern-day Silk Road,
Yeah,
but with a much broader scope and ambition.
yeah, that's a great way to put it. And it's not just about economics either.
Okay.
China is also increasing its military presence in the region, particularly in the South China Sea,
Okay.
which has raised tensions with neighboring countries.
So it sounds like a very strategic and calculated approach.
Yeah,
While the U.S. is kind of focused inward, China is looking outward, expanding its influence on the global stage.
that's one way to interpret it, yeah. And it highlights the importance of soft power, which we touched on earlier.
Right.
China is actively promoting its culture and values through things like Confucius Institutes and state-run media outlets.
Okay, hold on. You've mentioned soft power a couple of times now.
Yeah.
But I have to admit, I'm not entirely sure what that means.
Oh, okay.
Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure, yeah. So soft power is the ability to influence others, not through force or coercion, but through attraction and persuasion.
Okay.
So it's about shaping perceptions, building relationships,
Yeah.
and making your culture and values appealing to others.
Okay, so it's like winning hearts and minds rather than conquering territory.
Exactly, yeah.
And China is using things like cultural exchanges and economic partnerships
Right.
to build those relationships and increase its influence around the world.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's a long game.
Right.
They're playing for the long term, and it's a strategy that seems to be working.
So where does this leave the U.S.? I mean, if we continue to pull back from the world stage, what are the potential consequences?
Well, we could see a decline in U.S. influence and leadership.
Okay.
Other countries may look to China or other rising powers for guidance and support.
Right.
And this could really reshape the global order, potentially leading to instability and conflict.
It's a sobering thought.
It
But shifting gears again, let's bring it back to the U.S. economy for a moment.
Okay.
We talked about inflation and the Fed's dilemma, but
Okay.
what about the stock market? How are investors reacting to all of this uncertainty?
Well, it's kind of a mixed bag.
Okay.
Some investors are bullish, betting that the economy will continue to grow and that the Fed will eventually lower rates.
Right.
Others are more cautious, worried about the potential for a recession or a trade war.
So basically, nobody really knows what's going to happen. It's like trying to predict the weather 6 months in advance.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
Yeah.
The economy is a complex system with many moving parts.
Right.
And it's influenced by a wide range of factors, both domestic and global.
Mm-hmm.
So predicting its future is inherently challenging.
That's for sure. But speaking of complexity, let's circle back to something we touched on earlier.
A light.
The issue of government efficiency, or perhaps the lack thereof.
Ah, yes, that's right. The Elon Musk press conference provided a rather interesting glimpse into that world.
It did, didn't it? And while Musk was busy talking about streamlining government processes,
Right.
the administration was simultaneously facing accusations of waste, fraud, and abuse.
Right, exactly. And let's not forget the firing of those inspectors general.
Yeah.
The watchdog's tasked with overseeing government agencies and ensuring accountability.
Right. And those firings raised some serious concerns about transparency and potential wrongdoing.
Absolutely.
It created this perception that the administration was more interested in protecting itself than in serving the public good.
And it eroded trust in government institutions.
Right.
Which is never a good thing for a democracy. When people lose faith in their government, it can lead to cynicism, apathy, and even unrest.
It's a slippery slope.
It is.
But it's also a reminder, I think, that we, the citizens, have a responsibility to hold our leaders accountable.
Absolutely.
We can't just sit back and assume everything will be okay.
Right.
We need to stay informed, engage in the political process, and demand better from those in power.
Couldn't agree more. An informed and engaged citizenry is the best defense against corruption and abuse of power.
And speaking of being informed, we've covered a lot of ground today.
Yeah, we have.
But there's still so much more to explore.
There is. The world is a fascinating and ever-changing place. And the more we learn, the more we realize how much we don't know.
That's what makes this deep dive so intriguing. It's like we've just scratched the surface.
We have.
But hey, that's the beauty of it, right?
Yeah.
There's always more to discover. It's amazing to think about everything we've talked about today.
Yeah.
It's like we've been on this incredible journey, connecting the dots between things that at first glance seemed completely unrelated.
It really is fascinating how all of these things are intertwined.
Yeah, I mean, who would have thought that, the price of eggs could be linked to wildfire recovery efforts, or that the name of a gulf could spark this whole debate about press freedom?
It really underscores the importance of understanding those connections, seeing the bigger picture.
Absolutely. And it's not always easy to do, right? I mean, we're bombarded with information from all sides.
Right.
And it can be so overwhelming to, sift through it all and try to make sense of it.
It's true. We live in this age of information overload.
Right.
And it's easy to get lost in the noise, but that's why it's so crucial to develop critical thinking skills, to question what we hear, and to seek out diverse perspectives.
One thing that really struck me throughout this deep dive
Yeah.
is just how much uncertainty there is, both domestically and internationally. The economy is volatile, the political landscape is shifting, and global power dynamics are, in flux.
Yeah, well, uncertainty is a natural part of life,
Right.
and it's certainly a defining feature of our current moment, but it's also an opportunity.
Oh, how so?
Well, when things are uncertain, it means there's room for change, for innovation, for new ideas to emerge.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. Instead of being like paralyzed by uncertainty, we
Yeah,
can embrace it as a chance to rethink old assumptions
exactly.
and create something new.
And that's where individual agency comes in. We may not be able to control the global economy or the actions of world leaders,
Right.
but we can control how we respond to these challenges. We
Yeah,
can choose to be informed, engaged, and proactive in shaping our own future.
I love that. It's empowering to remember that we're not just like passive bystanders in all of this.
Right.
We have a voice and we can make a difference, even in small ways.
Absolutely. Every action we take, every choice we make has the potential to, ripple outward and create change. And collectively, those individual actions can add up to something truly transformative.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What do you hope they'll walk away with?
I hope they'll walk away with a sense of curiosity, a desire to learn more, and a willingness to engage with the complexities of our world. I hope they'll see the connections between seemingly disparate events and understand that their actions, no matter how small, can make a difference.
And I hope they'll remember that, even in the face of all this uncertainty, there's always hope. There's always the possibility of a better future, and we all have a role to play in creating it.
Beautifully said. And remember, this deep dive is just the beginning. The conversation continues. Explore the sources further, delve deeper into the issues that resonate with you, and keep asking questions.
That's right. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring.